Hello, I'm David Lima, the chairman of the Linda May and Lima Foundation. In September 2023, the foundation presented the first of two installments of a story about Elk Grove area families. In the first installment, we presented the story of a man named Richard Phelan, who in the 1890s was convicted of murder, sentenced to 25 years in Folsom Prison, and later received a full gubernatorial pardon. Researching this story led us to Richard's marker in a quiet corner of the Elk Grove Cemetery and the large family plot of the Springsted and Edgington families. These families came to Elk Grove in the 19th century and were prominent in the area well into the 1960s. This is the second installment of the Chronicle, where we'll present the stories of the Springsteds and Edgingtons, two Elk Grove area pioneer families. We'll trace the travels and history of these families beginning in Europe to the American colonies, where they arrived between 1652 and 1721, and their involvement in numerous historic events and moments in early America, through their generational migration west, eventually crossing the plains in the 1860s to settle in Elk Grove. Each story was extensively researched by combing through public and archival records, newspaper accounts, and reviewing personal letters, photographs, diaries, and personal mementos. Like the stories of more recent arrivals, what is revealed is the richness of history and culture brought to Elk Grove by these early settlers. Their stories reflect over 300 years of the American experience. While doing family research, we try to find and delve into any unique aspects of the story. With these families, there was much to choose from. With the Edgingtons, we peeled back layer after layer of fascinating connections of their family to many historic events of early America and personal links to several historic figures. They constantly found themselves on the leading edge of settlement and politics. Like over 250,000 other westward migrants, the Springsteds and the Edgingtons both traversed over 2,000 miles in 3 to 6 months to reach California. But uniquely, the Springsteds kept a log of their journey, allowing us today to get a sense of the context of the challenges, heartbreak, and elations they experienced. But perhaps the most intriguing discovery is that both families disappeared from the Elk Grove landscape nearly 50 years ago. So let's explore how these stories unfolded. Before we get into the story, let's talk about this family summary sheet, which we'll use as our roadmap throughout this adventure as we climb up and around the family trees. Without the roadmap, we're likely to get stuck stranded on a branch and in a time where we'd rather not be stuck. I have to say, as you'll see, tracing these families and charting their family trees turned up a unique genealogical outcome, which is why we need the roadmap. Every so often, we'll put up this graphic and highlight the section being discussed, like this. Hopefully, it helps keep us in sync. Let's begin with the Edgington or Edgerton family tree. By the way, like many families, the name spelling changed somewhere along the line. In this depiction of the family tree in America, which we'll use throughout this presentation, we show their heritage starting in the upper right, angling down through the generations to the left, and ending at the bottom of the page with the members of the family who lived in Elk Grove. So let's begin. The story of the Edgingtons in America began with George Edgington. Here's our first roadmap reference. That's George in the upper left of the roadmap. George was born in Wales in 1707, and at the age of 14 he was severely disciplined at school with a whipping. Rather than return home after school and risk even more discipline, he went to the docks and stowed away on a ship. After a few days at sea, he was discovered and learned that he was headed to Philadelphia. He arrived in 1721. The next notice of George was in Philadelphia in 1743, when at age 36 he married 19-year-old Margaret Broom, who was born in Philadelphia in 1724. The couple soon moved to Hampshire County, Virginia Colony, British America. They settled on a plot of land granted them by Lord Thomas Fairfax, governor of Virginia Colony. The land grant was in today's West Virginia along the South Fork of the Potomac River. Whoa, wait a minute. How could a 14-year-old stowaway end up 22 years later with a grant of land from the royal governor of the colony of Virginia? This is a little bit like watching an episode of Outlander. Have you seen the series about a Scottish clan who teleport back and forwards from Scotland to the colonies in the 1700s? Anyhow, we gotta dig a little deeper here. So, who really was this stowaway kid, George? The story just seems outlandish. Get it? Outlandish? Outlander? Oh, okay. Sorry. Anyway, this story doesn't add up. A 14-year-old boy stows away on a ship to escape being punished for a school incident, and he ends up in the New World with a royal land grant. So, the first question might be, could George have truly attended school? Well, in 1700s England, the schooling depended on class, occupation, and gender. Peeling back the layers of George's ancestry, we discovered that he actually descended from British nobility. So, given his family's nobility, George most likely was a schoolboy. But before we go further, let's have a quick review of the British peerage. Knighthood is the highest rank, followed by Duke and Duchess, Marquise, Marchioness, Earl, Countess, Viscount, Viscountess, Baron, and Baroness. To be called Sir meant knighthood, while Lord or Lady could refer to any of the other ranks. In exploring George's family tree, the terms Sir, Lord, and Lady are everywhere, going back to at least the 1300s. So, George truly was from British nobility. A deeper look at his ancestry reveals that George's 5 times great-grandfather was a knight in Chester County, as was his 4 times great-grandfather, who was a knight chancellor from Ridley in the county, which is about 35 miles south of Liverpool. Closer to George, his grandfather was the 3rd Earl of Bridgewater, a township near the Welsh border from which shipping has occurred since at least the year 1200. George's father was a landowner with significant influence and authority in the community. But now, George was a stowaway, and stowaways were not particularly uncommon in 1700s England. However, most stowaways were found before they left the dock and were thrown off the ship. Those who weren't found until they sailed were forced to work off the price of their passage. Ship's captains were also known to spirit boys from the dock, essentially kidnapping them and forcing them to labor on their ship. Imagine the horrifying reality hitting the captain when he discovered that he had left port with a 14-year-old boy of a prominent British family. Without knowing for certain, it's most likely that the remainder of the voyage was made very comfortable for young George. But what happened when they made port in Philadelphia? Again, the captain most certainly made sure that young George was well cared for before he made sail. But why didn't George return to England? Perhaps the accommodations in Philadelphia were too comfortable. Or maybe because his father died shortly after George had stowed away, return plans hadn't been made before his father's death. Or perhaps he simply wasn't returning, no matter what. Regardless, stay he did, and 22 years later he married Margaret Broom. So now the question is, who was Margaret Broom? Interestingly, like George, she too was descended from British nobility. Margaret's 6 times great-grandfather was also a knight, and served as the High Sheriff of Halton, Oxfordshire. Through the generations, the Broom family held royal appointments to many administrative functions of the monarchy, including military service. Margaret's great-grandfather arrived in the colonies in 1642 when he was appointed by King Charles I to regulate civil affairs in the Maryland colony. Later, he was commissioned by the king to lay out parishes for and was a vestryman of the Christ Church. Margaret's grandfather and father also had responsibilities under royal authority while being prominent landowners and merchants in the colonies. With scores of titles populating each of their family trees, like knight, lord, and lady, and every rank from duke and duchess to baron and baroness, it's safe to assume that when George and Margaret married in 1743, they were well positioned to receive a grant of land from Lord Fairfax in the Virginia colony. As to the Virginia colony, in the early 1700s, Thomas Fairfax, 6th Lord Fairfax of Cameron, inherited over 5 million acres in Virginia in what became known as the Northern Neck Proprietary. Fairfax went about the business of granting plots of land to settlers for either lease or ownership to generate income from rents and or taxes. It took as many as 6 to 7 years to complete the grant process, with the first step being that each parcel had to be surveyed. From 1749 to 1752, Fairfax hired George Washington as a surveyor for grants of land on the proprietary, so maybe the tract of land granted to George and Margaret was surveyed by George Washington. Regardless, what we do know is that George and Margaret prospered and built a good life in colonial Virginia. They built a house, planted and harvested crops, hunted and fished, acquired livestock, and communed with their neighbors. 5 sons would be born to them over the next 10 years. Thomas in 1745, Joseph in 1748, George in 1751, Isaac in 1752, and John in 1754. By this time in North America, 3 nations laid claim to varied territories, sometimes overlapping. Through various charters, treaties, and agreements with Native American tribes, Britain, France, and Spain claimed vast expanses of North America. Interestingly, where George and Margaret made their home was in an area disputed by the French and British. Both the French and British pursued settlements into tribal areas beyond their boundaries of agreements, which caused tribes to constantly divide loyalties and frequently change alliances. In the mid-1700s, tensions rose between the British and French, erupting into what became known as the 7 Years' War, pitting British colonies against French colonies, with both sides supported by various Native American tribes. George and Margaret were about to be thrown into this turmoil. In 1754, George made a trip to a grist mill, not too far from their homestead. That evening, the mill came under attack by a Native American tribe aligned with the French, and George was taken captive. He was taken to Fort Duquesne near Pittsburgh and held there by the French. In November 1758, with the fall of Fort Duquesne, George returned home after 3 years of captivity. Here he found that Margaret, believing he had been killed, had remarried the year before. George and Margaret's new husband agreed that Margaret should make the choice between them. She chose George, the father of her children. The other man left and was never heard from again. George and Margaret settled back into their normal lives. Margaret gave birth to 3 more children, son Jesse in 1759, daughter Hannah in 1760, and daughter Jemima in 1765. George and Margaret had 8 children in all, 6 of those children marrying and starting families of their own. Despite such deep roots, George, Margaret, their children, and grandchildren would all move away. Principally because although war had officially ended in 1763, conflicts between colonists and Native Americans continued. For the next few years, the family moved between different land holdings, eventually settling along the east bank of the Ohio River in today's Weirton, West Virginia. The family lived in a red brick house which still stands, not far from the approach to Fort Steuben Bridge. In 1773, Margaret died and was buried in a private plot near the house. George Sr. died in 1791 and was buried next to Margaret. During the Revolutionary War, 6 of their sons served in colonial military units. In 1778, sons John and Jesse were among the soldiers tasked to reconstruct and defend Fort Pitt near today's Pittsburgh. The fort was commissioned by Congress as the headquarters for the Western Theater of the Revolutionary War. Son Thomas served as a spy for the frontier rangers who patrolled the frontier from Ohio to western Illinois on horseback and by boat. Thomas was captured in 1780 and held by the British at Fort Detroit until the end of the war in 1783. It's interesting to think of the huge swings in political alliances which the family underwent, given that George Sr. was of British nobility, received a royal land grant, was captured, and held for 3 years by the French. But yet the family went to war against the British, and Thomas was held prisoner by the British for 3 years during the Revolutionary War. By the early 1800s, George Jr. and his family had migrated across the Ohio River and put down deep roots. Many hundreds of their descendants are still an integral part of the area of east central Ohio, western Pennsylvania, and northern West Virginia. In 1825, the story of the Edgingtons in Elk Grove began with the birth of Levi Clay, L.C. Edgington. Here's Levi Clay highlighted on the road map. L.C. was born in Manchester, Adams County, Ohio. He was the great-great-grandson of George Edgington Sr. In 1859, at age 34, L.C. married Lucinda Ida Latimer, age 19, who was born in 1840 in Whetstone, Crawford County in central Ohio. By 1860, the young couple had made their way across the prairie to settle briefly in Sacramento. Soon, however, they established a residence in Elk Grove and began a grocery and butcher shop business here. By all accounts, their life in Elk Grove was comfortable and successful. The couple had 4 children: Laura, born in 1864, Thomas, born in 1867, Marie, also known as Annie, born in 1870, and Ida, born in 1875. In 1877, Lucinda died. L.C. passed in 1884. After L.C.'s death, daughter Ida, who was born with physical disabilities, and young daughter Marie were raised by the Kaufmans on their ranch in Elk Grove near what is now Highway 99 and Laguna Boulevard. In 1888, Ida died at age 13. But let's take a look at L.C.'s and Lucinda's family. In 1882, Laura Edgington, aged 18, married Ernest Springsted, aged 24, in Elk Grove. Shortly, we'll learn more about Laura and Ernest and the entire Springsted family. Here's Laura on the road map. But let's skip ahead. Next is Thomas Edgington on the road map. After L.C. died in 1884, son Thomas, at age 17, took over the grocery and butcher shop business in Elk Grove. And in 1902, he married Catherine Cussick. Together, they had 3 children: Beatrice, born in 1903, Clyde, born in 1904, and Roy, born in 1910. Roy died as a child in 1914. In 1910, Thomas and his family moved to Grass Valley for a short time before returning to Elk Grove, where he continued as a butcher. Thomas died in 1935. Catherine died in 1949. By 1930, Beatrice and Clyde were married and both moved away from Elk Grove. Neither had children. So let's now move to Marie, who was also known as Annie. Here's Marie on the road map. In 1908, Marie, aged 38, married Richard Phelan, aged 50, in Oakland. They had no children. We already know their story from the first installment of this chronicle. So, except for Laura Edgington and her family with Ernest Springsted, that's the Edgington story. The family brought a rich American history to Elk Grove, and once established here, added much to the character and fiber of the community. Now let's explore the story of the Springsted or Springsteen family. Like the Edgingtons, the name spelling was altered for some reason along the line. Let's now shift to the Springsted side of the road map, on the right-hand side. Like the Edgingtons, the Springsteds too were early settlers in the American colonies, coming from the Netherlands to New York in 1652 and settling in upstate New York near Albany. After the Revolutionary War, a branch of the family migrated west to Illinois, while another branch migrated to New Brunswick, then to Ontario province in what was then Western Canada. These migrations perhaps indicate that the Springsteds were loyalists to the Crown and left the colonies, which, after the Revolutionary War, England welcomed such movements into Canada and the then western frontier of the United States. Regardless, the families put down deep roots, with many generations of Springsteds still living in both countries. The story of the Springsteds in Elk Grove began in 1836 in Malahide, Ontario, Canada, with the birth of Willard Alfred Springsted. A note of history about Elk Grove. Several early settler families migrated from the British Isles to this same far west outpost of Western Canada in Ontario province, with branches of their families later migrating to Elk Grove, including the Nelms, Chalmers, and Mahan families. But back to Willard Springsted. Here's Willard on the road map. In 1856, Willard married Mary Van Patten, who was born in 1837 in Aylmer, Ontario. The Van Pattens had immigrated from the Netherlands in 1664, settling in New York before relocating to Canada after the Revolutionary War. Also, likely loyalists. The couple began their lives together in Ontario and shortly added to the family with the birth of Ernest Willard in 1858 and Ida May in 1860. In the spring of 1861, the young family migrated by wagon from Canada to Sacramento to join an uncle who was already settled in Placer County just north of Sacramento. Willard left Ontario 2 weeks before Mary and the children and headed to Illinois, where he stayed with family while purchasing the necessary wagon, teams, and supplies for the journey. When all was in order, word was sent to Mary for her and the children to travel by stage and rail to Fulton, Illinois. From there, along with Willard's younger brother Barrett, the family began their western trip. When Willard left Malahide, Ontario, Canada, he started writing a journal about the details of their journey. That journal was saved and is now in the possession of the Van Patten family in New York. Reading from that journal, this is the tale of their journey to Sacramento. 7 April 1861, California bound. At Detroit, stopped at Harris Hotel. 10 April 1861. Left Detroit for Chicago. 15 April 1861. War. Bought horses, harness, and wagon for a gold watch and $50. 17 April 1861. Visited Uncle Augustus and grandmother's graves at Grand Detour, Illinois. 24 April 1861. Met Mary yesterday at Fulton. Camp 1. 2nd of May 1861. J. H. Jones's horse, lame. Feel very bad. Cold. 3 companies camped on the river flats tonight. A great many going to California this spring. Camp 5 miles. 10 May 1861. Saw a horse been bit on the nostril by a rattlesnake. 27 miles today. 16 May 1861. At Omaha today. Sunny. Very fine morning. Feel pretty sore today from walking yesterday. Delayed at the Missouri River some few hours. Ferry fees $1. Cross Missouri River 1 mile west of Omaha. 25 May 1861. Fine day, traveled 19 miles. Camped on the prairie opposite island in Platte River. Wood on the island. Camp 29. 1 June 1861. Fine morning. Hunting buffalo today. 2 antelope, no buffalo. Very scarce. Saw 3 Sioux Indians. Castle Creek, 20 miles. Fine day. 9 June 1861. 2 small companies to join us tomorrow. Must make Laramie next Sunday. 3rd week, 126 miles. 10 June 1861. Came 25 miles to Crab Creek. Boy badly hurt yesterday with wagon run over. In sight of Courthouse Rock and Chimney Rock, 23 miles. Near Scotts Bluff. 17 June 1861. Broke hind axle of wagon 7 miles above Laramie. Bought old one from trader for $2. Came 23 miles, hilly, on hard roads. Drove until 12 at night. 21 June 1861. Dinner on river, 14 miles from Camp 35. Feed poor, road middling. Roads very hilly. Camped tonight on river, drove 26 miles. It's this evening, as Willard was swimming to an island in the Platte River to retrieve firewood for the campfire that evening, that he drowned. From this point forward, Mary kept their journal. And here, Willard came to an untimely death by trying to swim the river. We buried him by the roadside, but his spirit has gone to God who gave it. 22 June 1861. Left Willard's grave this morning. Was hard to leave him thus alone, but we were obliged to do so. Drove 22 miles. Passed a very lonely day. Camp 37. 29 June 1861. Forded the Sweetwater 3 times this morning. Stopped for dinner near ford number 4. Mountains in sight, covered with snow. Drove 25 miles. Camp 44. 5 July 1861. Crossed Green River this morning on the ferry. Traded with Mormon woman for gloves. Camp 49. 22 miles. July 7th, 1861. Drove 17 miles. Camped at Fort Bridger. Feed good. Roads pretty good. Quite sick today. Children not well. 14 July 1861. Laid over today in the great city of Salt Lake. Went to church. Heard Brigham Young preach. Saw a very large, intelligent, well-dressed congregation of between 5,000 and 6,000 people. The service was held in a bower. Camp 58. 2nd of August, 1861. Left Mr. Richardson's train this morning. They could not come on for sick horses. Passed the grave of a young woman buried this year. Camp 77. 25 miles. 4 August, 1861. Saw lots of Indians. Camped on the Humboldt with 3 other trains. 6 August, 1861. Drove 15 miles this forenoon. Roads very good. Feed good. Like riding through a wheat field. Plenty of Indians. Camp 81. 10 August, 1861. Reached Lawson Meadows this day noon. Lay over and cut hay for horses. Bought flour at trading post. Trader let us have meat for 20 cents a pound. A trader made me a present of a can of quinces. 14 August, 1861. Left Warm Springs this forenoon. Drove 12 miles across the desert. Mr. Richardson's train came up with us tonight. Camp 89, 12 miles. 16 August, 1861. Camped on desert at Buffalo Springs. Joe's horse sick today. Mr. Smith and Mr. Schofield took tea with us. Left Mr. Hubert with sick horse. Camp 91, 18 miles. 20 August, 1861. Met Frank Jones today. Horses tired. Had corn and potatoes for dinner. Feel very homesick today. 23 August, 1861. Horses not well. Will lay over a week here on Susan River. Helped Ms. Johnson and Louisa and earned some money sewing for Mrs. Johnson. Made mince pies. 1st of September, 1861. Camped for night at Pierce's Ranch. Put horses in stable and breathed the warm air of Sacramento. Camp 107, 28 miles. 2nd of September, 1861. Camped for night at Gridley's Ranch. Ernie got badly scalded. 3 September, 1861. Started very early and reached Uncle's about 11 o'clock. We are at our journey's end for now. Mary and the children stayed for a while in Sacramento, but as a widow needing to find a way to support her and the children, she soon found work as a teacher in Elk Grove. Here, a man named George Kerr was the schoolmaster. George, along with his brother Joseph, came to Elk Grove in 1852. George was a carriage maker. Joseph was a blacksmith. Both became prominent businessmen and agriculturalists, growing trees and grapes and producing wine, raisins, and vinegar, and were the first to plant vineyards in Elk Grove. Both had a keen interest in education. A courtship ensued between George and Mary, and in 1864 they were married. Mary, Ernest, and Ida moved into what was then known as the Kerr House on Walnut Avenue in Old Town Elk Grove. In 1898, George Kerr died. At that time, Mary reverted to her first married name of Springsted, and the house became known as the Springsted House. In 1882, the connection to the Edgington family occurred when Ernest Springsted, now 24, married Laura Edgington, age 19, in Elk Grove. Here's where we are on the road map. So let's now complete the story of the Edgingtons as we review Ernest and Laura's family. Together, between 1883 and 1888, Ernest and Laura had 3 children. Vivian, born in 1883, Ernestine, born in 1885, and Roy Vernon, born in 1888. Roy died as a child in 1894. In the late 1800s, Ernest became postmaster of Elk Grove, and in 1895 he became a field man for the Sacramento County Assessor's Office, later promoted to be the Chief Deputy Assessor, a position he held until 1920 when he was allowed to take a leave of absence due to ill health. In 1903, Ernest and Lorna's daughter, Vivian, married a man named Fred Pearl, divorcing, however, soon after. In the early 1900s, Vivian worked as a clerk in the Elk Grove Post Office and later became postmistress when her father became Deputy Chief Assessor. In 1906, Vivian remarried to a man named Edwin Welch. They divorced in the 1920s. Also in 1903, Ernest and Lorna's daughter Ernestine married a man named Bun Smith. From 1915 to 1942, Vivian and Ernestine, along with Ernestine's husband Bun, owned and operated the Smith and Welch General Store, later known as the Red and White Store, in the Hossman Building at 9085 Elk Grove Boulevard in Old Town. Bun and Ernestine lived in an apartment upstairs in the building. Beginning in 1934, Bun operated a real estate insurance and notary agency in the front of the building until his death in 1955. Ernestine lived in the upstairs flat for the rest of her life until passing in 1968. It was Ernestine and Bun who, in 1954, were estate executors of Ernestine's Aunt Marie Phelan. They settled the various land and gold mine holdings of Marie and Richard Phelan. Now let's look at Ernest's sister, Ida. Here she is on the road map. In 1887, Ida, at 27 years old, married a physician, Charles Powers, in Sacramento. Together, they had 2 children, daughter Callie in 1888 and son Willard in 1890. Unfortunately, Ida died 10 days after Willard's birth, and baby Willard died 3 months later. In 1891, Dr. Powers and 3-year-old daughter Callie moved to Sanger, Fresno County to live with his parents. In 1908, Callie married a man named Archie Vayu. They were divorced in 1911. Never remarried, Callie died in Napa in 1966. Before Callie and Archie divorced, they had a daughter, Laurel, born in 1911. She married and moved to Florida in 1928. Here she had 3 children. Laurel and her family remained in Florida. And so, this concludes the Elk Grove Springsted story. Let's now take a minute to review the Edgingtons and Springsteads of Elk Grove. Levi Clay Edgington died in 1884 at age 59. He and Lucinda Latimer, who died in 1877 at age 37, had 4 children, Laura, Thomas, Marie, and Ida. Laura died in 1944 at age 80. She and Ernest Springstead had 3 children. Vivian died in 1941 at age 58 with no children. Ernestine died in 1968 at age 83 with no children. Roy died in 1894 at age 6. Thomas Edgington died in 1935 at age 68. His 2 children moved from Elk Grove. Beatrice died in 1978 at 77 in San Francisco with no children. Clyde died in 1956 at age 52 in Los Angeles with no children. Marie Edgington died in 1954 at age 83 with no children. Ida died in 1888 at age 13. As to the Springsteads, Mary Van Patten Springstead Kerr died in 1917 at age 80. She and Willard Springstead, who died in 1861 at age 25 on the trail, had 2 children, Ernest and Ida. Ernest Springstead, as we've said, died in 1923 at age 65. He and Laura had 3 children, none of whom themselves had children. Ida Springsted died in 1890 at age 30. She had 2 children, Willard, who died in 1890 at age 3 months, and Callie, who died in 1966 at age 78, with 1 child who, as an adult, moved to Florida. Like the Edgington family, the Springsteds came to Elk Grove through trial and tribulation, with high ambitions and expectations to leave a strong family legacy. But with the passing of Ernestine Springsted Smith in 1968 in Elk Grove and Beatrice Edgington Callaghan in 1978 in San Francisco, there were no descendants of either the Edgington or Springsted's families that came west, remaining in Elk Grove or California. This is very rarely seen with pioneer families who, during their lives, work so hard to put down deep roots. In researching these family stories, there were many aspects which roused our curiosity and notice. We chose to highlight just 3 unique aspects. First, the New World trappings of both families, in particular, the deep immersion in early American history by the Edgingtons. Second, the detailed descriptions of the wagon train west by the Springsteds. And third, after such robust beginnings, the rare occurrence of the disappearance of both families from the Elk Grove landscape. Regardless, the Edgingtons and Springsteds, as well as the Phelans, left deep footprints on the history of Elk Grove, adding much to the richness of the community's past. This has been a production of the Linda May and Lima Foundation and is protected by copyright. To enjoy other productions of the Foundation, please visit our website at lmmlfoundation.org.